Welcome to Salmon Wars, the podcast where we dive deep into the challenges facing the iconic salmon of the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Cody McLaughlin, a passionate salmon fisherman in the last frontier of Alaska. Join me as I interview a wide range of experts, including biologists, commercial and recreational fishermen, advocates, native people, politicians, and other stakeholders. Together, we'll explore the driving forces behind the dramatic decline in salmon returns and seek solutions to save these vital fish populations before it's too late. This limited-run investigative series will take you on a journey through the complex world of salmon conservation and management. Subscribe now to join the fight to protect our salmon and preserve the rich ecosystems they support. Together, we can make a difference in the future of these magnificent fish. Welcome to Salmon Wars. All right, Laine Welch, thank you for joining the Salmon Wars podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for your interest in Alaska fish issues.
Thank you. As it is my adopted home state, and just being somebody who's been a long-time fisherman, it's kind of a passion project for me. You know, no big sponsors and stuff like that. This was just something this was a story that I thought needed to be told. So that's kind of how I came up with the idea. I'm an outdoor writer, much like yourself, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about writing today.
Yeah.
I write for a lot of fishing and hunting magazines, and then I wrote an article last year about how, trawling is killing like legendary Alaskan salmon fishing up here in Alaska. And it did really well. And I felt like I didn't have enough words on the page, like enough allowance from my editor for words to really tell the full story. So I'm also a podcast producer. So I started thinking about producing a podcast. I looked for hosts. Nobody really wanted to do it without payment and stuff. So I just decided I would host this one myself. And here we are. I'm talking to some really interesting people about what is, in my opinion, probably one of the top 3 conservation issues of our time. The fall of the Pacific salmon is a story that we've seen this movie before, right here in America. And
right.
As I was telling a couple other guests, right here next to me on my desk, I have a little library of anadromous fish books because I'm a big anadromous fish nerd. And one of them is called The President's Salmon. I would love to have the author of that on the podcast. So I will drop a special episode with you right now if you're listening. But as I've told the story a couple times, the Penobscot River in Maine was the site of the largest run of Atlantic salmon on the East Coast. And the Atlantic salmon is the 6th North American species of salmon. It's endemic to Europe and stuff as well, all around the eastern rim there. But in my lifetime, and I'm 31 years old, I just turned 31 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a time when the first Atlantic salmon of the Penobscot River was gifted to the United States president as a big ceremonial gesture every year. And through the course of that, like, relatively short lifetime, now I'm no spring chicken anymore, but I'm definitely not in my senior years yet. I've still got some row to hoe, if you will.
Yeah.
That tradition has not just died, but those fish, which are the cousins to the 5 Pacific salmon species that we're here to talk about today, have been enlisted under ESU protections. There's less than 100 fish that get returned to the Penobscot River every year, and then they're extirpated from almost every other river in their range. So, I'll start out the podcast by asking you a quick question, and then I'm terrible at introducing people, so you have to forgive me for that. We'll get back to that shortly after this. But the number one question I like to ask all the guests is simply, do you think that Alaska and the Pacific Northwest have a salmon problem?
Definitely. All signs point to problems, even despite some of the record sockeye runs that occur at the world's biggest sockeye fishery at Bristol Bay. People look at that fishery and go, hey, no problem there. But yet they're seeing everywhere else in the state real red flags about the number of fish returning, the size of the fish returning. lots of cyclical ups and downs, which is normal. But, it's no secret that the North Pacific waters are warming faster than elsewhere in the world. And, it's, it's been pretty well proven that that's affecting the the entire food chain for all of the fish that are out there in the ocean. The warming water means that the metabolism of the salmon increases. They need more food, but the quality of the food that they're getting is, diminished, probably for the same reasons.
Okay.
That the temperature, the off-kilter ocean chemistry is definitely affecting the stocks. There's no question about it.
All right, that was a great intro. Now let's get back to, before we go on, and because we launched right into this thing, which two passionate people about the subject, that's what people are here to listen to. But real quick, just wanted to make sure everybody knows like who you are, Laine Welch, Alaska Fish.News. Tell us about your story, your career, how you kind of first came in contact with this issue, how long you've covered it as a writer, a little bit about yourself there.
Well, actually, I came to Alaska from Cape Cod in 1985, and I was a radio entrepreneur on Cape Cod. I every day would broadcast the fish prices and landings from the Boston and New Bedford auction houses, and I was married to a commercial fisherman at that time. So and he was a trawl fisherman.
Yeah.
Anyway, as many people know, in the 80s, as the trawl fisheries started to crash on the East Coast, we came on to Alaska.
Yeah.
And in 1985, I ended up getting a job at KMXT in Kodiak, where we lived for 35 years.
It's my favorite part of the state, by the way.
Oh, Kodiak is awesome.
It's such a beautiful place.
The Japanese call it the Hawaii of Alaska. It is so true. But anyway, I got a job with public radio on Kodiak producing a 15-minute program called the Alaska Fisheries Report.
Yeah.
And I covered the happenings all over the state. So that's how I cut my teeth on the Alaska Fish Beat.
Yeah.
Then after 6 years in public radio, I went on my own. And to make a long story short, I had 30 radio stations and 20 newspapers. The radio stations, I did a Monday through Friday program called Fish Radio.
Yeah.
And then I wrote a Fish Factor column that was in 20 papers, including 3 nationals. So I was really proud of that through my time on the Fish Beat, I developed that wide of a voice. And I covered all fisheries everywhere. Markets is one of my favorites. My goal was always to try to keep things simple. Fisheries are so loaded with acronyms and difficult, hard words for anyone to understand.
Or even trawl versus troll, right? Like
exactly. Yeah.
That's a common one I hear.
Oh yeah, that one wreaks havoc. But anyway, so my goal was always to keep it simple, to talk about, for example, if salmon prices were way down, the impacts of farmed fish. Or, Alaska thinks it has the biggest crab fisheries in the world. No, they don't. Even at the height of, say, the snow crab fishery, Alaska maybe provides 10% of the product to the world.
Yeah.
Eastern Canada's the big hit for crab. Anyway, so I try to bring those issues to every listener. I wanted every Alaskan to listen and understand what I was talking about. And, then I retired 2 years ago, and I don't miss the deadlines, but
that's
I'm
why
still
podcasting is awesome.
Yeah, well, like you, I can kind of pick and choose when I want to write. And I've learned about blogging, so I have a real active blog, AlaskaFish.News. And, I'm still pretty much on the beat every day, practically, because it's just so interesting and important. I learn something every day, probably like you do too, Cody.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've even learned a ton through the course of filming this podcast
Yeah,
series.
yeah. And I think it's important to have that voice. I have a recognizable name.
Mhm.
And sadly, I mean, as an example, not that I'm the only one, but for example, the salmon numbers for the 2024 season came out a few weeks ago.
Mhm.
Not even a mention in Alaska.
Nope.
You know? So anyway, even though it's the industry number one private employer, seafood top export by far has been for decades, it gets very little attention, in my view, from the media.
Yeah, that's really one of the things I wanted to talk with you about. You touched on a few things that I think we want to get back to, but you've got a long and storied broadcasting career, like in this particular space, talking about fish and salmon and stuff. And the name of the podcast, obviously, if you're listening, you're aware of this, is called Salmon Wars. And that's because through the course of the investigation I was doing just to try to understand this issue, I came to find that this has been a long-standing issue in the state. Now, salmon are culturally endemic to, well, I would argue all of America, but really specifically the Pacific Northwest, because all of the iconic imagery and iconography that's tied to the identity of our region, from Alaska all the way down to Oregon, California, all across the
Right.
western seaboard, is tied to fish. Like, stretching back thousands of years to the First Nations peoples and the native tribes that, were here before us. They, even their art and iconography was centered around fish and fishing. And it's just such an important part of the regional culture that when you take that in juxtaposition to the cratering of these stocks, right? And it's not just one thing. Like I've heard experts on this program talk about a couple of things. Trawl bycatch, that's one big human-led consequences. You just talked about ocean warming and the changing biology and biochemistry of the ocean. Hatcheries, and competition from hatchery fish with wild native stocks. All all things that are affecting what we're doing here. But really, it shocks me that this is such a viscerally important issue to Alaskans, and it's really difficult even to get Alaskan media to talk about this issue.
Yeah. There have been some really good investigative stories, but they're few and far between. And, interestingly, in terms of the bycatch issue, bycatch, of course, has been an issue that's been discussed for years, decades. But Cody, it wasn't until the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers and Alaskan natives in those upriver villages were shut down even for subsistence. And that's the number one priority in the Alaska Constitution when it
Okay.
comes to fisheries. Shut down even for subsistence. That is when it put bycatch on the radar. Halibut didn't do it. Bycatch of other crab didn't do it. People have been talking about that. But when the Alaskan Native population out in the western region could not even catch a salmon for their smokehouse, that's when that's when the bycatch issue took on a life of its own.
Eh,
And sadly, that's what it took. But I believe strongly that we're just seeing the death of a culture in those regions.
okay.
You hear the elders bemoaning the fact that they don't have any salmon to train their children on the ways of cleaning the fish, smoking it.
Yeah, these are lost arts so that go away. I mean, it's a common refrain even back east. Another anadromous fish species, which I talk about a lot, is called the American shad. And this was called the founding fish. It's a fish that fed the revolutionary troops all the way through the Revolutionary War. Really, a fish that helped us win that war. And but it requires a very specific, because the boniest fish there is. It's a herring species, so there's
Right.
306 bones in it, and it requires a very specific fillet method in order to debone it. And that's an all but lost art on the East Coast, right? Which is where I think we're headed here if things don't begin to change. The loss of these means and methods and traditions, and as you said, the death of a culture. Those are the stakes. I think you're laying them out really well.
But I think the biggest issue is that fisheries management is not keeping up with the times. Um, Particularly the federal fisheries, the federal managed fisheries. Those are, your listeners might not know, from 3 to 200 miles out. Those fisheries in those waters are federally managed. From 0 to 3 miles out, those are state waters. The state of Alaska does not even have a bycatch policy.
Right.
And of course, the federal overseers manage.
I have to interject for a second. See, this is one of the things I'm learning. So the state of Alaska does not have a bycatch policy, right?
Correct.
Which, as the listeners will undoubtedly know by now, because we're talking a lot about bycatch on this show. Bycatch is when any fish is unintentionally caught. Okay, so like if even as a sport fisherman, if I'm going out for chums and I pick up a king, or what's more importantly, if I am out for trout this spring on the Parks Highway system here in the Matsu Valley, and I incidentally hook into a king, which are closed again this year, that is bycatch. Now,
Right.
how that's treated is different for everybody, right? But most importantly, for a sport fisherman or a subsistence fisherman, the rules are if you're catching unintentional fish that are like closed to season for any reason, whether they're out of season or the run has been bad, or or you're over your limit for that particular species or what have you, you are supposed to release the fish immediately and unharmed. Okay, you're not even supposed to pick the fish's head up out of the water. Okay, you can get in trouble for picking the fish's head up out of the water in Alaska for that, which I respect. And I follow those rules. I've got photos of myself releasing, back to what you said about the fish being smaller than ever, jack kings that I thought were trout last year when I was reeling them in, until I had them at the net, and then I realized that they were kings and I let them go, right? But at the same token, the state of Alaska does not have a bycatch policy for the 0 to 3 miles out like zone.
Well, I mean, they have a policy in terms of if you're, like you said, you catch fish that are too small, out of season, not allowed by your particular gear type, those fish are discarded. But there's no official bycatch policy outlined by the state of Alaska within 3 miles. But of course, the commissioner of Alaska Fish and Game sits on the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which oversees all of the fisheries in the federal waters. And that about 60 to 65% of the volume of fish come out of those federal waters. So the state of Alaska has a big say, potentially, in what's going on with bycatch in those federal waters.
Well, that's the frustrating part, right? Is as you say, Alaska potentially has a big say in what happens in those federal waters, but it doesn't seem like it's exercised all that much. It's shocking to me how much influence, frankly, Washington and Oregon have over what's happening and the depletion of. By the way, don't get me started on all the quote unquote keyboard activism and keyboard environmentalism down in Washington and Oregon over this issue, right? But Washington and Oregon, you'll see photos, I mean, straight from the pro trawl groups, of rallies down in Oregon and Washington to save Oregonian and Washington jobs, killing off Alaskan fisheries. And I'm just like, I'm sorry. I understand that public and federally managed waters are belong to all of us, but that's exactly the point, right? It doesn't belong to Washington and Oregon. It belongs to all Americans. So we need to preserve the cultural importance of these fisheries, and frankly, the fact that like it provides not only food security to the region, but to the rest of the world. And if we continue destroying the habitat and the again, I know it's called salmon wars, but halibut are having a tough time too, right? Like if we're
the sad fact is that the majority of salmon permits, for example, in Bristol Bay, are owned by outsiders. They call, in Alaska, they call them outsiders, non-residents. And almost 75% of all the value, Cody, of all ground fish caught in Alaska goes to Seattle boats.
wow.
So here in Alaska, the governor, the legislature are screaming about the need for new income streams, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet they're looking at 75% of the value of all ground fish caught in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Gulf of Alaska go out of state, primarily to Seattle. The large boats, the large trawl vessels, are dominated by ownership in Seattle. Like, for example, the Amendment 80 fleet, they call it,
Mm-hmm.
the one that's responsible. They target flatfish, flounders, turbot, flatfish. They it's a 19-boat fleet. Every one of those boats is home ported in Seattle. And that fleet is the fleet that is responsible for the bulk of the halibut bycatch taken in the Bering Sea. It's the nursery grounds for the entire stock, meaning that effect, that bycatch removal effect, is felt in British Columbia, Washington,
All the way
Oregon,
down to California.
as you said, right. And so that fleet, starting this year, now has a bycatch cap. It's been fishing for decades with no cap at all. It could take as much halibut, no worries. And by law, all of that fish has to be discarded over the side. And that fleet now has a cap. Thereby, every other user, subsistence, personal use, sport fishermen, commercial fishermen, have a halibut bycatch cap on all their fisheries, and all the bycatch that the halibut that's taken by the Amendment 80 fleet comes off the top of all the other users.
Yeah, well, and it's insane too, because not just a poundage limit, but also a geographical limit. Like that halibut nursery that you're talking about is off limits to other gear types, right? Like you can't drop a hook and line
right
down there because we all agree that the halibut nursery is important because halibut migrate out of there all the way down to California, right? That is where those halibut eggs, they travel along ocean currents and stuff. That's where they come to hatch, right? And then they travel back out to their home ranges. And I can't drop a hook and line there, but the Amendment 80 fleet can drag a net the size of a mini mall across the bottom there, and grind these halibut into chum. You know what I mean? Like it's bananas.
Yeah, and get this though. So now, starting in 2024, after 10 years of debate by fishery managers, they have now put a cap on the amount of halibut bycatch depending on the health of the resource, like every other user. What is the Amendment 80 fleet doing? They're suing NOAA to have that cap removed or raised. And yet these are people who claim they're partners in Alaska's fisheries. But Cody, the most important thing to remember, whether it's salmon, halibut, crab, herring, rockfish, black cod. These boats are obeying the law. They are required by law to toss fish that is too small, not a species that they're allowed to catch with their gear type, etc., like we mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So, there's a push on, and this applies for salmon as well.
Mhm.
And get this is the exact wording by the North Pacific Council about why bycatch caps are so high for the Amendment 80 fleet, the ones that fish on the halibut nursery grounds. They say because cost accruals would be so high that it would be unsustainable. So in my view, and as I've been writing, because this issue is now dominating me, they're saying right there, the costs that would be accrued by not being allowed to have so much bycatch, meaning they couldn't continue fishing, are more important than than protecting the resource. The cost accruals on such large platforms would be too high. It would be unsustainable.
And that flies, in my opinion, directly in the face of the entire North American model of wildlife conservation. So the Pittman-Robertson Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, all these different acts that were, maybe I'll give a brief history lesson on that on a bonus content episode, essentially were formed, in the early 1900s after market hunting and market fishing essentially wiped out almost all the wildlife in America. So especially all the iconic species, turkeys, deer, salmon. We instituted limits, and then with the limits, we instituted user costs for the resource in order to fund wildlife conservation, right? And so there was always the acknowledgement that if fish or wildlife pay, it stays, right? So if it pays, it stays. That's the common refrain, and that's the big fear that I think a lot of people share. And I want to get your take on it. Is what happens when we reach the point of no return where the pollock fishery is tremendously valuable right now because there's a lot of them. They're cheap to catch because of this indiscriminate fishing gear, which is what causes the problems that we're talking about today. But what happens when salmon runs dwindle so much that there's only 100 fish coming back to the Kenai River every year, let alone the Penobscot River in Maine? What happens when we get to that point? What happens when we're shut down on halibut, and then those fish, which also had their own monetary value, not just to the sport fishing fleet, but to the commercial fleet as well? Because like longliners go for halibut, which goes for, anybody who's seen halibut in the grocery store, you guys know how much it costs. Same thing with Copper River salmon, king salmon. What happens when those fish lose their economic value because we're not able to fish for them anymore? First of all, the pollock will not be able to replace all of that lost economic value, especially when you include the sport fishing fleet. But I want to get your thoughts on what the long-term ramifications are. Like, in your opinion, somebody who's covered this for 30 years, what happens to the state in that state of affairs? The salmon are gone, the halibut are gone, which we're really not far from those closures. I mean, kings are closed almost statewide, and especially in non-enhanced runs. What happens?
It's a good question. I mean, here we hear all of the most knowledgeable scientists talk about, as I mentioned, the off-kilter ocean chemistry, the warming oceans affecting the entire food web. Well, a lot of these species are part of that food web. And so, for example, the pollock catch has been increased. Herring bycatch has been increased. The black cod bycatch increased. I mean, how much life can you suck out of an ecosystem?
What people, I think, don't understand is well, let's ask this question. Why do the salmon and the halibut get caught up in the same net as the pollock, right? like, what are they doing in the same part of the water column? And if you really ask yourself that question with an honest face, you will know that the salmon, the big old king salmon, especially in the chums, like the larger species of salmon, and the halibut are predatory fish, and they are feasting on the forage fish, which school up in certain areas of the water column. And that's what they're doing
Yeah.
there.
And another interesting thing is pollock, a small pollock, is one of the favorite foods of chum salmon.
It,
So of course the chum salmon is going to be mixed in, you know, feeding on the small pollock, and caught,
okay.
But there is no chum salmon cap, or the trawl sector.
Okay.
And the trawl sector, again, predominantly homeported in Seattle, has said they will not accept a chum cap. And another interesting thing is that as all of this discussion has been going on, and the North Pacific Council is famous for delaying and discussing things for decades before they make a decision. So here we have supposed partners in the fishery saying they will not accept a cap on chums, and they're always deflecting the discussion, Cody, to the genetic makeup of the salmon. They're saying things like, a lot of the salmon bound for Western Alaska originates from Russia, originates from Asia, on and on and on. Well, fine. But, when I have made a point to personally contact people out in Western Alaska, and they've told me they don't give a darn where the salmon originates. They just want to be able to catch some.
Right.
And to me, that, yes, it's important to know the genetic origins of a stock. But when Western Alaskans are not allowed to catch a single one, whereas the trawl sector is allowed to catch, hundreds of thousands, I don't see that the origin of those fish is the answer to the issue. But again, I'm going to come back to this time and time again, Cody. People need to realize this is the law. This is the fisheries rules of the road outlined since the mid-1970s, when foreign fleets were thrown out of Alaska waters, not just Alaska waters, but the U.S. set a 200-mile limit called the Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ. Foreign boats can no longer come in and fish that 200-mile limit. They called it Americanizing the fleet, and they did. That was in the mid-1970s. The Magnuson-Stevens Act and the national standards in that act direct the bycatch policy for the nation. They have not been updated for 20 years, the bycatch. Some parts of the Magnuson-Stevens Act have been updated, but not the bycatch ones. And they have not been updated for 20 years. Get this. Last year, NOAA Fisheries, the big overseer with the North Pacific Council that sets policy for the federal fisheries, proposed to update 3 of the national standards in the Magnuson-Stevens Act. One of them was to reevaluate bycatch regulations. The state of Alaska, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, and all of the native corporations that are invested in primarily the federal pollock fisheries, each of those entities, the state of Alaska, North Pacific Council, native-owned corporations, wrote to NOAA saying no changes are needed in Alaska's fisheries bycatch policy. Everything is working just fine. That's when I started saying, I'm going to use my voice to begin trying to educate people about the importance of getting these laws changed. Right now, you don't like it, too bad. These fishermen are obeying the law.
Yep.
And, my whole life has been fishing. I know there's not a fisherman alive who wants to dump good fish, but they're required by law to do it. And the mega moneyed corporations are taking full of that, to the full extent of the law, taking advantage of that legally. But now people are saying, enough. This can't continue. There has to be better policy, better respect for our marine ecosystems. It's not sustainable.
No, it's really not. All right, so over the course of your covering of this issue, let's talk a little bit about sustainability, but from a different tack. We know that there are huge corporations, even family-run dynasty corporations that make a lot of money, essentially from bycatch, right? Like from the trawl fleet. I'm curious, just over the course of the time that you've covered the issue, how has the increase in bycatch and the amount that they're pulling out of this water, we know how it's affected the fish, because that's pretty obvious to anybody who can see the salmon returns every year. But how has it affected the economy, right? Like the availability of jobs. You're from Kodiak, right? We're probably one of the hottest spots in the state, if not the nation, for this debate, because a lot of the trawlers are actually docked there in Kodiak. How has that changed, though, over the years? Would you say that there's more trawl fishermen and less hook and liners, less lodges, less sport fishing guides? How has that evolved over time?
I don't think there's been a big change I think Kodiak has maybe a fleet of maybe 35 trawlers, smaller ones, and most of them are not what catcher processors or
The large,
big boats
the
that
super
catch
boats, yeah.
and process the fish at sea, like the big boats in the Bering Sea. Another thing that bears repeating, Cody, you see a lot of calls for trawl to be banned. That is not going to happen. Kodiak runs on pollock and flatfish. Dutch Harbor, #1 port in our nation, runs on pollock and flatfish and other ground fish, right? It's a year-round fishery in Kodiak. It's what keeps those plants pumping year-round, not just pollock, but cod, rockfish, all in the ground fish, sector. Salmon, yeah, that's a big blitz in the summer months, but it's ground fish and primarily pollock that keeps these major ports operating year-round and keeps the economy, solvent. So no, yeah, they were successful at banning trawl in Southeast Alaska. A different marine ecosystem there. They're not dependent like Kodiak, Dutch Harbor, king salmon. King Cove, Sandpoint. They're not as dependent on the groundfish fisheries. They're not pretty much not at all. But for people to think the trawl fishery is going away, that is absolutely a pipe dream. However, they can do better. And it's not been until the past few years that they've really been called out.
And
And there are so many experiments going on, some in Alaska, excluder panels, using LED lights to direct king salmon out of a net, et cetera, et cetera. But there's not been a real big effort by any means in Alaska to embrace those technologies or to tow slower. That's been proven that allows bycatch species to escape just by towing slower. There are things that can be done, but it hasn't been until I'd say the past 4 years that Alaskans, and again, thanks to the salmon issue, or no thanks to the salmon issue, that's raised the bar. And interestingly, too, I remember going to the North Pacific Council meetings starting in the 80s, and the makeup of the council then was very different. They were fishermen, some group NGOs, lawyers. Now the makeup, primarily in the Alaska 6 votes on that council, are representatives of the major trawl companies. I mean,
That's what I was
and
saying. Yeah.
and people will say, well, isn't there a conflict of interest? Say the vice president of an organization whose boats are trawl boats, right?
Yeah.
And they're a voting member on the North Pacific Council, just as one example. Um, they'll say, well, why aren't they conflicted out? Well, according to federal policy, the North Pacific Council or other regional council members are advisory members. So they are not held to the same conflict of interest standard as are employees of the federal government.
Yeah.
So all they
Which
have
is
to do
which is
is
insane because
sign.
this is the equivalent of the CEO or the chief legal counsel of Goldman Sachs being on the SEC. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
the current, not a past guy that like left and he's got a lot of knowledge about the industry, so he becomes a regulator, right? Like we're talking about active employees of the regulated industry.
Whose paychecks are dependent upon the success of the trawl or groundfish fisheries.
Yeah.
And they're the ones making the decisions. Now, interestingly, the Board of Fisheries, the Alaska State Board of Fisheries, which oversees the management and rules of the roads for the fisheries 0 to 3 miles out, for all fisheries, subsistence, sport, commercial, you name it, within 3 miles, if they even have a family member who is involved in a fishery that they are deliberating over, they're conflicted out. And yet you look at the federal management oversight, where 60 to 65% of Alaska's fisheries volume comes from, no problem. I have fox guarding the hen house, icons all over the stories I've written on my website.
Yeah, that's the
It's just that to me, I don't get it, but then another problem, and might be getting into the weeds a little bit too much. We talk about the Alaskan natives whose culture is dying in terms of the use of its iconic number one food source, salmon. But since the mid-1990s, Western Alaska groups, Alaska corporations, were given royalties of pollock and then eventually all the groundfish in the Bering Sea and crab. So now we have Alaska Native corporations owning these huge 300-foot trawlers, all home ported in Seattle. They're Alaska owned, but all home ported in Seattle. And some of them now are saying their logo is Pollock Provides.
Oh,
So what a conundrum. We've got Western Alaska natives who cannot catch one salmon for subsistence, and yet boats that they own or their representation in what they're called community development quota groups, CDQ, they're out there catching part of the problem. I mean, what a conundrum. How do you solve that?
that right there is where I want to go next, right? Now I'm not expecting you to solve all the problems here, but what I'm trying to do with this series is really educate the listener about not just the issues and like the tremendous complexities involved in these policymaking decisions, but really try to chart a path forward through the eyes and the lenses of people on the ground like yourself who've been at the forefront of this issue for so many years. So my question really is like, what 3 to 5 policymaking decisions, like if they made Laine Welch the Queen of Alaska for 24 hours, what would be the 5 policymaking decisions that you would make on this issue to protect the salmon in perpetuity? What would be your kind of top priorities there?
There has to be a limit on how much salmon is removed by the trawl fleet. Again, trawling is never going to be banned, but there has to be some kind of a limit set just to protect the species. There has to be an end, in my view, to bottom trawling, such as the Seattle Amendment 80 fleet, fishing in the halibut nursery grounds. Even for part of the year. Likewise with the crab. I mean, here we have snow crab shut down for 2 years in the Bering Sea. A pittance of a king crab fishery. and yet the trawl sector is still allowed to fish there and take, for example, snow crab. Snow crab is now, because the stock crashed, under a 10-year rebuilding plan. Bycatch is not even included in the rebuilding plan. And, they say it's so negligible, it doesn't matter. Not even included. To me, the crabbers can't go crabbing, but not only was when the snow crab fishery was closed, the North Pacific Council increased the amount of crab the trawlers could take as bycatch by almost 1 million pounds.
My God.
They're now, through 2025, allowed to take over 4 million individual snow crabs in the Bering Sea while there's no fishery for the crabbers. That to me, the crabbers and other industry went to the North Pacific Council and said, we would like you to close down bottom trawling or trawling in the king crab molting and mating area, where, such as they've done anywhere else in the world, for 6 months, just during the mating and molting period.
Again, and tell people why that's important, right? Like, what does it matter if it's 6 months of the year versus 12 months of the year? Because it's not just because, that would essentially cut the catch in half, but it would cut the mortality by an even greater amount. Because during the molting season, right, is when, if you're ever on the East Coast and you've had soft shell crab, that's because during the molting season, they lose the toughness of their shell. So the reason that's a big policy sticking point for a lot of people is that during the molting season, which has been extended because of the warming oceans, right? This all ties back together again.
Right.
The mortality rate of squishing them in with thousands of other crab and fish and halibut in a giant net the size of a football field that's packed to the brim with sea life is 100%. None of the crab that are caught survive. They don't get tossed back into the ocean during that time. They are mush by the time they get onto the
But they're not even counted. I mean, if
well, how can you when they're ground into mush,
Right, but if a crab leg is brought up in a trawl net, that is not counted as a crab loss, or if it's squished to mush, like you said, that's another thing that I think has to be changed, is some of these definitions, Cody, that are in the Magnuson-Stevens Act that outline the rules of the road. They, for example, a big thing going on now in Alaska fisheries, and it has to do with salmon and other species, is what they call midwater trawls. The word is pelagic. NOAA defines pelagic as fishing in midwater the midwater column, right? Well, the North Pacific Council last year, its own staff, for the first time on paper, came up with a report that showed that the midwater nets are on the bottom, averaging 80 to 85% of the time. And yet they get different treatment under NOAA regulations because they're supposed to be midwater when in effect they're actually fishing most of the time on the bottom. And NOAA said they do not have the power to regulate that. So now the North Pacific Council, they're debating the definition of midwater and how it fits with that fishing gear. Meanwhile, they're fishing in the crab grounds. Right at this time of year is when the Bering Sea crabbers begged, please, 6-month moratorium on fishing during this time of year. The council deliberated and went, it doesn't really fit our definition of an emergency. So business as usual. That to me is, I was famous for years, Cody, for being the cheerleader for all of Alaska's fisheries, including trawl, because they're such an important economic, provider to the state of Alaska for the overall volume and the fish tax, right? That's a whole nother story. But once I retired, I said, I can no longer be silent about what I know and the background I have and the references that I can link, to the kinds of things we're talking about. How can it be that a little Alaska Native family on the Yukon can't catch one freaking salmon, and yet the trawl fleet has no limit on how much chum salmon they can catch, and a low cap, somewhat of a cap, 70,000 or some number like that for Chinook salmon. How can that be? And yet NOAA and the North Pacific Council have a big thing going now about equity. Everyone, no matter where you are, will be treated equally. Where's this equal treatment with the usage of salmon? And and that's another thing. For 30 years, I've been hearing about the need for fishery managers at the federal level to include the knowledge by the Alaska Native people. Just now, NOAA comes out, we have a big equitable, philosophy now. And the North Pacific Council is inviting Alaska Natives to express themselves, but they don't have a voting member on the panel. They want them to express themselves, but no, they can't vote. They call it, traditional knowledge. And they're making a big show about incorporating traditional knowledge. We want to hear from you. To me, that is so much window dressing. Too little, too late. They should have been listening to these elders on the Yukon, the Kuskokwim, out west in Nome, for the past 50 years when there were first signs of the species experiencing trouble with the marine environment. And that's what people believe, that with salmon, most of the difficulty with the fish is in the marine environment. Like we pointed out, food source, warm water, hatchery fish. There's another conundrum. Huge push in Alaska to reduce the amount of hatchery fry that are released to the ocean. It's, I think, usually in the billions. And they're also being released in Russia, Korea, Japan, those nations.
Yeah.
But you talk to the salmon fishermen in Southeast Alaska about the importance of hatchery salmon to their fisheries. If there were no hatchery chums, just as one species example, in Southeast Alaska, those fishermen wouldn't have a fishery. I mean, the hatchery salmon in Alaska provides 1/3 of the volume and the value, typically, in each year's take. So there's another issue. And I know I digressed beyond salmon, but I think that's okay.
Oh, yeah. No, that's quite all right. Focused on salmon, but as we've said many times, it's germane because this is a food web. The reason that the salmon are so important is because they're so interconnected with every other species in the state. Not just the fish in the ocean either. Every tree along every river in Alaska is fertilized by
and the
returning salmon
bears
who
and
die
the
along the
animals
rivers.
feeding on them, and the nutrients in
The
their
eagles.
bodies that replenish the waters and the earth. Yes, it's But
Mhm.
the one message again I'm going to say to anyone who is concerned about bycatch of salmon or any other species, they have to make their voices heard at the federal level. The state, they can do it at the state too, but the problem lies in those federal waters, and they have to be in touch with their people, their reps, the policymakers in Washington, D.C., that this is unacceptable. That is the only place where they can change the standards in the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act that dictates the rules of the road with fishing. That's it.
Laine Welch, tell listeners how can they find more about Alaska Fish News, your blog, other resources that might be helpful to them as they research this for
Well,
themselves.
now AlaskaFish.News is the blog,
Mhm.
and I'm kind of new at it. I'm expanding it to have right now people can go there when salmon season starts, find daily catches everywhere in Alaska. Right now they can see the catch levels and the ports of halibut landings in Alaska. I have all those Alaska catches, and now I'm adding news links. So I'm showing people where they can go for more information. But AlaskaFish.News, that's my new way of keeping on the beat.
All right. Thank you so much, Laine
Thanks,
Welch.
Cody.
This is Salmon Wars.